Okay, hello. Welcome back, everybody. This time I'm taking a look at 5 more of the worst trains ever, parts 6 and 7 from History in the Dark. I did watch through parts 3 to 5 several months ago in one video, which ended up being way over an hour long, and I decided that it would just be best to just do 2 of them at a time, just to avoid making things over an hour long again. And if you do want to see that video, I will be linking it in the description, but be warned, like I said, it's very long and you don't have to watch the entire thing. But it will be in the description if you want to view it out of interest. And the 2 original videos that I'll be watching will be in the description down below. So without further ado, let's start up.
The Caledonian Railway 956.
Okay, that was a bit sudden. Like, no intro. Like, I know this is before the, when he had his intro, so that was quite sudden how it started up there. All right, I'm sorry.
The Caledonian Railway 956 class. In before someone's like, it's actually Caledonian Railway or something. I think it's a hard C, but it...
Or Caledonian. I guess I'll just stick with Caledonian. I'm not European, so I try my best sometimes.
It might be a soft C. C's are funny like that, but I always thought it was Caledonian. So I'm going to go with that. It doesn't really matter. 956 class. These were 3-cylinder 460 steam locomotives, and they were used on the Caledonian Railway from 1921. They were also the largest design operated by a Scottish railway. They were pretty big locomotives. They were very large and impressive.
Interesting. But I was not expecting these to be the biggest because, I have seen what they had in Russia. The AA-20, I think it was. That thing was way too ginormous for their railways. But yeah, fairly surprising how this thing happens to be the biggest thing that Scottish railways had. And it has a decent looking design to it.
And in terms of like their appearance, yeah, that stuck. Like they were good looking trains. Also, they were really just freaking terrible.
Well,
they were described by several authors in various ways, but one of the quotes I'm gonna list is that monumental flop of all time, or as ineffectual giants. So, yeah, the biggest problem with these is their inability to steam. The steam engine, as I'm sure most of you are aware, require steam to operate, and a big part of that is building steam pressure. And for various reasons, these engines just could not maintain steam pressure. Firemen always struggled to keep them up to pressure for them to actually, function. They couldn't build enough steam. That was major, and, that's on top of the other minor problems, like too small of an ash pan, which caused choking in the grates. That was good, too, Why not just add that on top of it? And they never really got any better, unfortunately. Because they were non-standard, they weren't even considered to be rebuilt. So they were just withdrawn. And as far as I can tell, they were scrapped. There were only 4 of them. So,
yeah, well, unfortunately.
The British Rail Standard Class 8. I
don't want to hear your ramble about seeing British Rail again, okay?
Why you? But you're pushing it. You avoid a diesel. Diesel's like, steamer. Address it anymore.
Get to the point already.
I can't deal with these people. I can't deal with them. I don't want to. I don't want to address it anymore. It's just a thing that keeps happening. There's no escape. The Class 8 was a single example of a locomotive. A 462 Pacific was built in 1954. It's also known as the Duke, and I'm just going to keep calling it that. Rather, Duke of Gloucester, I think is how you say that.
Gloucester. I don't know either, but pretty cool it does look, at least.
The British people are going to be like, actually, it's pronounced Gloucester or something. I'm sorry, I'm American.
Actually, it's pronounced Gloucester. I'm sorry, I'll stop.
Leave me alone. We already won the revolution. I'll throw the tea in the harbor again. Don't you tempt me. The Duke had significant issues when it was first introduced. It was a poor steamer from the get-go, but on top of that, it also had heavy fuel consumption. Large engines tend to be that way, but if you're going to be taking a lot of fuel, you better be working. And it didn't steam well, so it was eating fuel and not actually doing anything.
So it consumes fuel quickly, a lot actually, and it can't steam properly. That's just beautiful.
Result. The poor drowning of the locomotive meant that it couldn't adhere to timetables very good, and even though British Railways did take some evaluations to try to see what they could do, they got nothing but negative feedback, and it only operated for 8 years. Now you'd be curious as to why these photos you're seeing.
That's a pretty short service life, right?
And it only operated for 8 years. Now you'd be curious as to why these photos you're seeing are actually all really recent, like they're in color and like good definition. Like these obviously weren't taken in the 60s, so what gives? Well, the Duke actually stands as a pretty wholesome story when it comes to train history. He was originally going to be scrapped. He was sent to the Woodham Brothers scrapyard in Barry Val of Glamorgan, South Wales. But a group of railway enthusiasts actually became wise to this and decided to purchase it outright. They spent the next 13 years refurbishing it and making modifications to the design.
13 years? Just to modify this thing after purchasing it? That's remarkable. Like, seriously, remarkable. Like, I'm actually really glad they did that. That was amazing. And I'm so glad that we still have it today. So shout out to those guys who brought it back, really.
The result is that nowadays, and yes, the Duke still runs, it's actually one of the most efficient and powerful steam locomotives to ever run on British Railways. Class 8 is a testament to what happens when people who really love trains and locomotives and all things going into rail fanning, or whatever you call it, come together to do something great. And
I love when that happens. It's really remarkable when we all come together, restore something, a locomotive like that, to operating order and still here today. It's incredible what us as rail fans enthusiasts can do to help out.
Things going into rail fanning, or whatever you call it, come together to do something great. And I just love the massive fail on British Rail's part here. Like, okay, you guys couldn't figure out how to make this steam engine work. You didn't bother with it, you decided to scrap it.
But then when a bunch of rail fans enthusiasts bought it, they tinkered with it, they fixed it. Oh, that's funny. I mean, I'm sure it's not like British Rail didn't at least try to fix it. But still, that's funny.
So a bunch of rail fans who just care. Like, they just care. Choose to spend their own money, buy the engine, spend 13 years fixing it on their own, and make it run better than you ever could. To the point that it still runs now. Wow. Look, I mean, I'm all for a win on the rail fans' part here. This is wonderful. But also, like, how inept are you people? Why are you doing this to me? Why are we having this conversation again? Every single list, I look at your stupid logo, and every single time you have disappointed me. Why are you the way that you are? It's what I want to know.
I don't know, but I don't want to sit for hours just to listen to you complain about them like this with the logo. It gets a little tiring sometimes when I just want to learn some history about some failed locomotives. It just drags on.
The Fontaine 440.
Oh, dear God. One of these things? And I thought I already saw one of those before. Okay. It looks goofy as hell and stupid. I know. But Please tell me, why was that thing made?
Sorry, I can't even look at it. Give me a second. Okay, I trust you has the questions here, and I don't blame you. What the heck is going on with this thing? Well, a little backstory. All right, so the Fontaines were a pair of engines built by the Grant Locomotive Works. They were designed by Eugene Fontaine of Detroit. Although they're a French design, they were built in America. So I don't know who can be blamed for this. I'm just going to go with Eugene Fontaine for it. We're not going to get national about this. We're just going to say it was Eugene's fault. So Eugene really thought that this was a good idea. So you're probably wondering what's going on with the extra wheels and why they're not on the ground and what the deal is with the cylinder being, up like that. Like, that's not nothing about this is normal, is what I'm trying to say. So the crank turns the wheels like a normal engine. You can see it there. That wheel moves, and then because it's touching the lower wheel, it will turn like a gear, except like not like a gear because there's no pegs like on a gear, and that will drive the engine forward. Now you may be wondering, well, what the heck is the point of that? Because why not just angle it downwards like a normal steam engine and just, move the driving wheels directly?
What was the bright idea?
This is an excellent question, and I will give you the answer that I have been given, which is a really dumb one, but this is honestly what Eugene thought. Eugene Fontaine's explanation is that he felt this design would actually increase the speed of the engine overall. Quite why he thought this is anyone's guess, because the Fontaines weren't any more capable than a normal steam engine at that time. Like, the Americans that, the Fontaine is very similar to.
I mean, I thought he built it this way to maybe have increased tractive effort, I guess. But I don't see these things going that fast. And I'm sure their design would have highly restricted their speeds to begin with.
And was eventually rebuilt into, was just as capable as this weird, off-putting, bizarre technique of, like, having the wheels together. And in fact, this is arguably worse, because you have these wheels touching each other, and the drive is dependent on those wheels being in contact. That means that there's just another surface where wheel slip can occur. Like, the wheels aren't like gears.
Right.
There's no pegs, like I said. So if the wheels slip, like, it's just one more thing that can go wrong for literally no benefit. Like I said, they were rebuilt into conventional American types. 440s again, but with like the cylinder and the crank and everything in the right place. And when they did that, they were fine. Like in terms of like their actual inner workings, their boilers, everything like that, they're pretty much okay. Like they weren't anything terrible or exciting in that regard. It's just this weird thought that Eugene had with the wheels being. I don't know why you thought that was going to work.
It was stupid.
The IC4, manufactured by the Italian train company Ansaldo Breda. Okay, I'm going to be real here. This is one of the most recent things I've ever discussed on this channel. And in fact, this is the first time, unless you count the Pacers, which I'm pretty sure have all been withdrawn by now, this is the first time where we're talking about a train that is technically still in service. This thing is still being used. And there's a lot to unpack in this topic, and I assure you there is no amount of fast talking that I can do that will really explain what a absolute mess this entire story is. So I'm giving you a very, very, very abridged version of the events involving the IC4. Now,
Okay, just unfold it all. Just tell me what's wrong with these things. Whatever it is, I can take it.
A very, very, very abridged version of the events involving the IC4. Now, the IC4 was manufactured by Ansaldo Breda, like I said, and it was meant for the Trans-Great Belt routes of Danske Statsbaner, which is Denmark's national railway operator. We're just going to call them DSB because Lord knows I've already mispronounced it. And in fact, I may mispronounce a lot of things because I don't speak Danish. These trains were purchased under DSB's Good Trains for Everyone plan, which is really wholesome, and I like it. But this didn't go well, because the original contract said these things were supposed to enter service in 2003, and it wasn't until 2007 that the first train set, because they were sold in sets, finally entered service for testing. So we're already, 4 years late, and that's just one train. They ordered
4 years late just for one set? That can't be good.
4 years late, and that's just one train. They ordered many that weren't delivered. And believe me, this controversy runs deep into government corruption and fraud claims and a whole bunch of other things involving Ansado Breda.
Oh boy. Like a whole lot of political nonsense I very likely do not care about, since that makes it into a whole bigger mess as is.
Where they just seem either sketchy at best or just really inept. Perhaps both, because the government of Denmark had spent a great deal of money on these new trains, as did the DSB. Yet, the trains weren't being delivered, and even the ones that were suffered serious mechanical issues. It didn't help that they already had to spend money lengthening the platforms just for these new trains, so they spent all this money to set things up for them, and when they were delivered, they were late, and they weren't working. They suffered many electronic issues mostly, and as well as an overabundance of exhaust, which these are supposed to be environmentally efficient, so good work there, guys. One of the more alarming flaws was that there's an onboard computer system that's supposed to help stop the train if there's a signal that says to stop. Well, apparently this system has a bunch of bugs, because 2 of the trains blew through stop signals. This resulted in the entire fleet, this was in 2011, so they had a few more, like 17 or so, give or take. They ordered like 70, by the way, just so we're clear, being taken off the rails so they could figure out what the heck happened, because they're lucky nobody was killed. And like I said, this story goes on and on and on to the point that it became not even worth it. What was worse is that in 2014, it got to the point where not only were the trains, such a pain in the butt with the constant mechanical issues, but they couldn't even be scrapped, because if they scrapped the trains, the amount of money they would get back would nowhere near cover their operating costs.
Wow. So you have some sets, these sets that are so problematic, they have not been delivered on time, they've been so late to delivery, they're so plagued with issues, like they're so bad that you're not even allowed to scrap them. Like, I don't think I've ever heard anything like that before, where any kind of train set or locomotive being so bad that you simply are not allowed to scrap them because of everything else. Like, that is just remarkable. And I'm surprised that nobody so far has gotten killed or injured from these things. And I sure hope nobody has as a present day, because that's pretty bad.
And the DSB would have to file for bankruptcy if that happened. Like I said, this is a serious abridged version of these things, and they are still currently used, but right now the DSB plans to phase them out by 2024 because they're just not worth it. Hilariously, one of the amazing controversies here is that one of the trains that was supposed to be given to Denmark was actually given to the former dictator of Libya, Muammar Gaddafi, in 2009, by the Prime Minister of Italy, Silvio Berlusconi. No, seriously, I'm not making that up. No, here it is on Google Maps. It's right here. It's still there. See?
It's just sitting there. That damn thing's just sitting there. I cannot believe that.
Sitting there. This is such a wow. I don't even know where to begin. I honestly never thought I'd ever talk about a train that was still being used on this series, but this is such a meat of a topic that I just couldn't resist. Kind of feel bad for Denmark. Believe it or not, this is not the only bad train that Ansado Breda delivered to a country in Europe. The Ansado Breda V250, or the NS High Speed V250, is another high-speed train that Ansado Breda was contracted to deliver to a country in Europe, in this case, Belgium and the Netherlands.
Oh,
and I bet you can't guess what happened. No, I bet you can't. Delays. constant delays.
Perfect.
And in this case, the trains were even worse. That's why it's in the number one spot. Because these tended to, just fall apart. No, really, like, some of the floor plates were found falling out of them. Like,
Christ.
really. They were terrible. If you're wondering why these countries seem to keep contracting on Salto Breda, even though they seem really bad at their jobs, well, this is only in the last 2 decades. Before all this happened, Ansaldo Breda wasn't that bad of a company. They actually made trains that were, halfway decent. So it wasn't like their history suggested that this sort of thing would happen. However, I do want to point out that there was a bidding war to do these contracts for these countries between several companies. 2 of the companies in particular are actually a little familiar. Alstom bid to do a train. They made the French TGV, and Simonsen put a bid, and they did the German.
Those things.
To do a train. They made the French TGV.
I believe I've seen these things before, at least models of them, but I know pretty much nothing about them. So maybe I'll think about researching them a little bit. And if there is a video about their history, I would love to see that.
GV, and Simonsen put a bid, and they did the German ice trains, both of which were alarmingly successful. Ansaldo Breda underbid the competition and said that their train would be faster. Let's think about that for a second. You're a company that's bidding lower than everybody else, but saying your train's going to be better for less. Because I don't know how familiar you are with, exchange of, commerce and things like that, and economics and capitalism and all this stuff. But generally, you get what you pay for. And if you're paying for less, you're going to get less. And that's absolutely what happened here. The trains are complete garbage. They had numerous technical problems, and hilariously, when Belgium called out Ansaldo Breda on this, Ansaldo Breda tried to blame them for running the trains in the snow, even though the trains were supposed to be capable of handling the snow, because I don't know if this is news to any of you, but it snows in Belgium. That's your problem. Oh, you ran into the snow. You shouldn't have done that. Dude, it's Belgium. Of course there's snow there. Are you saying your train can't touch snow? Because I got news for you. You're still into a place with snow. Like, you can't blame them when you specifically state that the train should be able to handle that. Like, that was one of the requirements, and you didn't deliver. Ansaldo Breda, by the way, isn't really a thing anymore. It was purchased by Hitachi Rail, actually, in 2015. Hitachi is another rolling stock manufacturer. They're Japanese. So from what I can tell, most of their deliveries have been pretty good. So hopefully now that they're under new ownership, Ansaldo Breda can stop messing around and screwing people over.
Yeah, that did not end well for them. Like, wow, that's another incredible failure on their part.
With that, until next time, this is Darkness, the Bidwell of Fawn, farewell.
Well, part 7 we go then.
The London, Brighton, and South Coast Railway I-1 class. Now, before anybody gets crazy, no, this is not a picture of an E2. Look at the wheels. It is different. Though admittedly the body does look a little bit similar to the E2s. But these are not E2s. These are I-1s. They were 442 tank engines. They were supposed to be able to haul secondary passenger trains as well as do shunting work and things like that. Most things that tank engines are supposed to be for. They were built between 1906 and 1907. And, they didn't go well. They were. I don't know if it's just this cutesy shape that keeps happening, where if it looks like an E2, it's not supposed to do well. But the I-1s are actually a lot worse than the E2s, in my opinion. In fact, they were so bad that they were reportedly given the nickname, and I don't say this lightly because, I don't try to use coarse language on this channel, but this is historically relevant. The crews gave them the nickname Wankers. Yes, really.
Oh, those crews, man. I love it.
The crews gave them the nickname Wankers. Yes, really. The reason is they were awful. They couldn't steam effectively. And, when a tank engine can't do that, that calls into question some serious concern, because tank engines are small, so they shouldn't have an issue building up steam pressure. But for whatever reason, the I-1 just couldn't deal, and this is due to its boiler design. The boilers just weren't efficient. at all and required too much heat from the firebox in order to build up pressure.
And it has a very small tank area for the coal. Like, it should have a tender for that kind of design, right?
Now, to the I-1's credit, they were later rebuilt in the 30s, and they were redesignated I-1Xs. Ooh, edgy. But they were much better in this form. Their boilers were switched out. They lasted until the 40s then. They were withdrawn by 1951. And none survived into preservation, in case you're wondering, because, they got better. That's why they're low on the list. They were awful, but they got better when they became something slightly different. But whatever. It still counts. Don't yell at me.
Better than nothing.
The Erie L1 class. Ooh, I'm excited. I get to talk about camelbacks now. Because you're probably looking at this and you're saying, what the heck is that? Okay, backstory. Camelbacks are a specific type of steam locomotive.
Oh, yeah, I forgot. I completely forgot about them camelbacks. Please fill me in on these things.
Backstory. Camelbacks are a specific type of steam locomotive that is sometimes confused with camel locomotives. They are not the same thing, even though some people use the terms interchangeably. That's wrong. It's horribly wrong. But they do have one thing in common, and that's the general X-axis placement of the cab. The reason they're called camels and camelbacks is that the cab is placed in the middle of the locomotive. In the camel's case, the cab is placed on top of the boiler. The reason for this was to put as much weight on the driving wheels as possible. Camelbacks are similar, but their cabs are actually built around the boiler towards the middle. And the camels and the camelbacks were built for two different reasons. Like I said, the camels were built to put as much weight on the driving wheels as possible. Camelbacks were created out of necessity to add a larger firebox to the locomotive design. The initial problem came down to the need for a firebox that could burn anthracite waste. Now, anthracite is a form of coal, just so we're clear. Now, the firebox could be built, but it required a very large model. So large that if you put the firebox in its traditional place in front of the cab, the driver couldn't actually see forward. So the idea was to simply move the cab in front of it and keep the fireman back behind so he could shovel in coal. That's where the camelback design comes from. There were a few different ideas involving this, and one of them was indeed the Erie L1s. Now, the Erie L1s are an insane 0880 steam locomotive. They were the only articulated camelback locomotives ever built, and when they were built in
The only articulated design for camelbacks? Wow.
Now, the Erie L1s are an insane 0880 steam locomotive. They were the only articulated camelback locomotives ever built. And when they were built in 1907, they were literally the largest steam locomotives in the world at that time. Now, the camelbacks in general have some issues, and so do the camels, actually, and it's mainly down to safety concerns. For one thing, the placement of the cab here puts it in spitting distance of the side rods. Crews were worried that if the side rods snapped at any point due to a mechanical failure, they would get, impaled. Which does happen. Not the impaling part, but the side rod snapping part. But normally they're in position behind the locomotive, and this wouldn't be a concern. But with camelbacks, that was something that was possible. But the bigger issue was the location of the crew members. As you know, the basic steam engine will have at least two crew members, the engineer and the fireman. In a traditional steam locomotive, they would occupy the same place. But on a camelback, that can't be done because the firebox is behind the cab. The fireman would be behind between the engine and the tender, taking care of the firebox, while the engineer would be, doing his job in the cab. But this meant that the crew couldn't communicate effectively. There were no radios back then, and steam engines are pretty loud when they're going. So in a situation where there was an emergency, the crew wouldn't be able to tell each other what was going on. It didn't help that the poor firemen, with a lot of the camelback designs, were exposed to the elements. There wasn't really much in the way of shelter back there. So if it was raining, the fireman was just out of luck and just had to deal with it.
Yeah, definitely see those safety concerns now. Those poor firemen and engineers who had to operate them things to suffer through those if they had to.
The engineer was mostly comfortable. By the way, for this reason, this design never really took off in terms of camelbacks in general. As for the L1 specifically, the reason they didn't take off is that they were just, this is weird. They were too powerful. Like I said, these were the biggest locomotives in the world at the time, and they made a whole incredibly large amount of weight. Now, they could do this, but their problem was that it was almost impossible to stoke a fire hot enough to meet their capabilities. Because the firebox was enormous on these things, it meant that the firemen had to work really, really hard. On top of that, as time went on, more efficient designs came out that were just as strong, if not stronger, with smaller fireboxes due to, different design mechanics and changes to the locomotive infrastructure overall. The fact is, the L1 just didn't do what they were supposed to do effectively because they were too hard to work with. There are actually rumors that this locomotive's firebox actually required 2 firemen to work it. Now, I will tell you, A, that's not true. At no point is there any evidence to suggest that there were 2 firemen working on these things.
And if there ever was such a case, that would be insane.
At no point is there any evidence to suggest that there were 2 firemen working on these things. Although, B, that may have actually fixed the issues. They would have had to pay another fireman, which, make operating costs a little more expensive. But if there were 2, maybe they could have gotten away with this locomotive's insatiable hunger for constant, unspeakable heat. But the fact was, they just didn't function the way they had hoped they would. They weren't efficient at all. No matter how powerful they could be, the amount of effort that it took to get them to work just didn't mean anything. Eventually, they were actually rebuilt as 2 882s with more conventional rear-located cabs. They wound up being more efficient in this form, but even then, by the 30s, their designs were obsolete, and they were all scrapped.
Oh, well.
The British... You know what? No.
Questioning life choices.
The British Rail Class 43, also known as the Warship Class. I want it on record that I would see. So what's wrong this time? History in the Dark, please tell us. Tell us now. Please, we have to know. We have to know how they messed up. It's so important to our daily lives. Fine. You want to know?
Yeah.
These were, okay. Class 43 was part of the modernization plan that was meant to replace all the steam engines in one sweeping motion, where they would create a bunch of diesels that would do all the jobs the steam engines used to do. It's going to be perfect and happy, and nothing, went right. They were diesel hydraulic, which is already a questionable decision, as people have pointed out that they were way, way too high on maintenance. But that is really not the problem with the Class 43. Now you're probably wondering, why are they called warships? Well, it's actually quite simple. In the UK, most trains are given actual names, and in this case, this class was named after warships within the British Royal Navy. Also, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that I think the Royal Navy deserves better than to be associated with these glorified pieces of scrap metal, but that's just me. Also, they shouldn't be confused with the Class 43 HSTs, because those are completely freaking different, and I don't know why they're called the same thing. But they're not the same thing.
These things look cool. Kind of aesthetically pleasing, if you ask me.
Those are actually good, for one. Now the real question is, what specifically is wrong with the warships? Okay, so Class 43's biggest issue was down to how they were built. They are extremely similar in design to the Class 42 warships, which are almost exactly the same in many regards. Now, you may be wondering, well, what's wrong with the 43s if they're so similar to the 42s? Well, the 42s were built by Swindon Works, and the 43s were built by North British Locomotive. Wondering, well, what's wrong with...
Don't these things kind of resemble the character Diesel 10? I mainly recognize, the shape as well as the wheels, but I don't know if he was based off of this model specifically. If anyone can tell me down below, please do. Because I want to know.
The 43s, if they're so similar to the 42s. Well, the 42s were built by Swindon Works, and the 43s were built by North British Locomotive Company, NBL. Now, when they were going over the designs for the diesel locomotives overall, Swindon decided not to cut corners, basically, with the overall positioning of things, as well as the materials they were using for the parts that they were putting into it. NBL did cut corners. They used mild steel for the exhaust manifolds, which was prone to fracture, so that was good. Their
Great.
piston ring life expectancy was severely decreased. Oh, and they also screwed up their math when they converted from metric to imperial. And it meant that a lot of the measurements for basically everything in the locomotive were slightly off by, like, decimal points. And I know that doesn't sound like a big deal, but as any mechanical engineer can tell you, no, that's a huge deal. You cannot just no, that's not okay. So basically, the end result is that the Class 43 warships were terrible. Bizarrely, were actually used a lot by British Rail despite their unreliability. And it was probably because that when they were working, they were capable of hauling long-distance passenger trains really well when they were working, which was rare. But when they were, they could do it. But they were all withdrawn by the early 70s and replaced with other things that were, in theory, better, but it's British Rail, so who knows. And none of these survived into preservation.
No,
The Great Western Railway 111, also called the Great Bear.
Oh, the Great Bear. I've heard of this one before. But at the same time, I don't mind being filled in again. So, go ahead.
What a grand-looking steam locomotive. And I honestly hate that I have to put it on the list, because I mentioned it in the last video. And, you gotta give it this. And everything we talked about so far. The Great Bear looks phenomenal. I mean, that is a gorgeous-looking steam train. But was it good?
Unfortunately not.
No, of course not. We've been over this. Anytime something appears on this list and it looks nice, it really does only look nice. Because there's been a lot of that, where a lot of trains look great. But that doesn't mean they function. And in fact, its grand size were largely part of its issues. The overall design didn't take into account the effects that would have, and the result is that the tube and barrel length of 23 feet meant that it had no efficiency. Like, it looked great and big and grand, but it was completely inefficient when it came to overall power output, as well as keeping steam pressure. Now, it could run and do things, but the biggest issue it had was that it didn't outperform anything else available on the rails at the time. Its best trait was that it served as a convincing, pretty centerpiece for the Great Western Railway, because the engine does look very nice, and that was often what it was used for.
Yeah, but when you're using something, it has to be far more than just a showpiece, which the Great Bear, unfortunately, just was not.
It was for public relations, especially considering this was, at the time, one of the few Pacifics on British lines. It wasn't until later that they would add more of those designs overall. The Great Bear was eventually rebuilt as a 460, called the Castle class. In that form, it was actually pretty decent, and it would serve till 1953, when it was scrapped. The South African class Afro 4000. Oh boy, another recent example?
I like how Afro was part of the name. Yeah, just give it a big fake afro on the top, and it'll look fancy.
Oh, goody. Built for the Passenger and Rail Agency of South Africa, or PRASA, as we'll call it, because I am not saying every single individual word like a crazy person. And they were meant to be the latest thing for South African rail lines. And to be fair, in its own way, anywhere else in the world, the 4000s aren't actually that bad. There's nothing inherently special about them, necessarily, but they don't actually have a history of severe malfunction generally. So what gives? Why is it even on this list? Well, I want to stress that I am specifically referring to the South African version of the Afro 4000s. Now, the story runs a little deep in terms of government corruption and corporate deviousness again, just like last time, so I'm going to try to give you the abridged version again. You are likely familiar with the concept of gauges, like railway gauges. They even use those in toy train, HO gauge, stuff like that.
Yeah.
Well, they do the same thing with actual trains. Every train has to be gauged for the lines it's running on.
And let me guess, this thing was probably too big for the rails it was supposed to be on.
A lot of people assume this just means the distance between the two rails on any given track. And that is part of it, but it also takes into account height. Different railways have different height requirements. The reason for this could involve a few things: the position of the signals, the wires they use for electrification for the lines, or tunnel height. Either way, any engine has to be rated and gauged appropriately for the lines it's supposed to be running on. Due to a bunch of corrupt officials, both involving the South African government, as well as involving Swifambo Rail Leasing, which was just a front for black economic empowerment, brokered the whole thing and used a Spanish manufacturer to create these engines, meant that they didn't actually bother to gauge these diesels at all. They could run on the rails, but when they actually did tests to see if they could fit on the lines, specifically underneath the pantographs, which is super relevant, they were found to only clear these lines by 10 millimeters, or 3/8 of an inch, which is cutting it way, way too close. That is in no way within safety parameters. When they attempted to run these things, this height issue actually caused an accident, almost killing the crew on board.
Jesus. That cap's destroyed.
These things, this height issue actually caused an accident, almost killing the crew on board. After that decision was made to just not run them at all because they weren't built for the lines. You can't call a train good if it can't even run on the rails safely. You run them forward and then you smack into something. Like, that's not...
Yeah, like, what were they thinking when they were building these things? Not testing out the proper gauges and such to run these things on. Like, it's certainly a unique case for an engine to be, for any kind of locomotive to not be good if it cannot run on the lines it's supposed to be on, because it's not appropriate for the size. Like, just like one of the other ones I just looked at, another unique case I'm just now learning about.
To just not run them at all because they weren't built for the lines. You can't call a train good if it can't even run on the rails safely. You run them forward and then you smack into something. Like, that's not normal. That shouldn't happen ever. According to my sources, the courts actually ruled in favor of South Africa in this case, regarding the state of these trains, and said that the company has to refund the money and take the trains back, though the process of recouping that loss apparently has yet to begin. As far as I can tell, the trains are still sitting down there, so we'll see what happens. Exciting, I think. No, the opposite. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all.
Well, that was certainly a way to end off. And ultimately, that's going to do it for the reaction, everybody. Let me know what you think down below. Parts 6 and 7 will be linked in the description down below, as well as my reaction to parts 3 to 5. Again, you don't have to watch that entire video, given how long it is, but I'm leaving it here just in case you're interested. Anyway, thank y'all for watching, and I'll see you next time.